So before we kick off, I'm, as a biochemistry major, very excited to start this conversation today with Dr. Wells. But before we kick off, I kind of wanted to tell you a little bit about him so you can have some background. If you haven't done your research, it's okay. You can read that Wikipedia page later. But Dr. Wells started out here as a student at UT studying biology, graduated a year early, and went to Harvard to do his PhD.
2 years.
Oh, 2 years early. Too good, too good. And did his PhD at Harvard in biology. From there, that work took him to do a postdoc fellowship at Stanford. And after that, he toured basically all of Asia and collected samples from thousands of people to understand the origin of humanity. And after that, he was a resident at the National Geographic Society, where he led multiple amazing projects, expanded the Genographic Project that he was working on over there, and most recently has worked on a company called Insitome. He's the founder and CEO of a gene sequencing company called Insitome that looks to help people understand their origin, their story, by sequencing their DNA in a way that's a little bit different from other companies of the sort. So can we kick it off for Dr. Wells, please?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming out.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. So you've been interested in genetics for a really long time, especially when you were a student here at UT. What got you started in this interest from an early stage?
So when I was a kid, the earliest career that I thought about seriously was to study ancient history, to be an archaeologist. The King Tut exhibit, so King Tutankhamun, the Egyptian pharaoh, there was an exhibit of all of the stuff that Howard Carter found in his grave that toured the United States in the late 1970s. And I went to see it in, I believe it was 1978 in New Orleans at the Museum of Art there, and stood outside in the rain for hours to get in. You have a little time on your ticket, and you're allotted that time and that time only, and went in, was absolutely blown away by it. This is stuff that looked like it could have been created the day before by a talented jeweler or sculptor, but it was 3,500 years old. And it was like traveling back in time. And I became obsessed with ancient history, distant past, read as much as I could on ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome, and then China and India and other places. And if we had had Indiana Jones in those days, I am dating myself here, I would have wanted to be Indiana Jones and go out and discover really cool things from ancient cultures. And so that was kind of the trajectory that I had set for myself. And then my mother went back to school to get her PhD in biology a few years after that. And so I was like 11, 12 at that time, and started hanging out in the lab with her and discovered that science is really cool, you know, the laboratory sciences. You get to use lots of really interesting high-tech equipment, and most importantly, discover new things on almost a daily basis. It's like it's your job to solve puzzles, and that was awesome. So ended up wanting to combine the hard sciences in some way with the study of our ancient past. And by the time I went to college here at UT, I decided that the way to do that was to study genetics, which is kind of the historical branch of biology, because we get our DNA from our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and so it tells us about our ancestry, all the way back to the origins of life. And so that's kind of the course that I ended up setting, using genetics to study ancient events in human history.
Oh, all right. So what led you from your academic path of studying these topics and the Genographic Project? If you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would help us give some background on how you came to be the founder of Insitome today.
Yeah, sure. So fast forward a little bit, I had gone to Harvard, Stanford, went off and drove across Asia for 6 months. Land Rover sponsored us, gave us a brand new discovery. We wrote to the board and said, hey, we've got this great idea. We're going to figure out where we all came from. All we need is for you to give us a $70,000 car. And they came back 6 months later and said, absolutely. What would you like it, kitted out as? Would you like gas or diesel? And what color do you want? All that stuff. So we were very lucky. And part of the reason we had done that is that I was a population geneticist in Luca Cavalli-Sforza's lab in the 1990s when he was trying to get a massive global DNA sampling project off the ground called the Human Genome Diversity Project. And he caught a lot of flack for that. There was some opposition from indigenous groups at the time who didn't feel included in the sampling strategy. A lot of people working on medical subjects weren't that interested in the anthropological questions that they were asking. And so the remit of our field kind of fell in between the NIH and the NSF and anthropological funding agencies. And nobody wanted to touch anthropological genetics. So we had to go directly to the public, because the public is really interested in this. I mean, when we discovered Genghis Khan's Y chromosome and published that in 2003, I mean, that made a Harper's List. It was reported on by like 1,000 different publications around the world. The idea that 1 in every 200 men alive today is a direct lineal descendant of Genghis Khan himself, a guy who lived only 800 years ago, it has some resonance with people. And so we decided that what we were going to do is tell stories directly to people and ask for sponsorship to go out and collect these samples. So that initial foray into direct public engagement on the scientific realm, doing science in real time and engaging with the public while you're doing it, that led to my entree with National Geographic and ultimately led to the launch of the Genographic Project. And so Genographic came out of the work that I'd been doing, a film that I made that aired on PBS and the National Geographic Channel in 2003. And Nat Geo basically asked me scientifically, if you could do anything next, what would it be? Which is kind of a cool question to be asked by Nat Geo. And I said, sample the world's DNA. And we want to do it in a big way and involve the public. So we went out and pitched it. IBM came on board as our partner to the tune of $30 million. The Waite Family Foundation, so Ted Waite, who had founded Gateway Computers, he had cashed out at that point. He was very interested in the work. Long story short, we got this huge, massive undertaking off the ground, and we're sampling DNA all over the world. But a big part of it was engaging with the public in a very direct way. So not just telling the stories, which we had done before, but offering for sale a DNA testing kit. So what we call the public participation component. This was the very first time that people had really done consumer genomics properly. And when I stepped out on stage in April of 2005 to announce this, so on stage, National Geographic Auditorium, we've got ambassadors in DC, from all over the world, press there. The then CEO of National Geographic, a guy named John Fahey, who had been CEO of Time Life and very storied past in consumer markets, pulled me aside and he said, listen, Spencer, we at Nat Geo really love this project. We love what you're setting out to do, really believe in it. But I got to tell you, I know consumers, and nobody's going to spend $100 to test their DNA. So you give that the soft sell. If you guys sell, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 of these in the next 5 years, let's say, you'll be lucky. So don't oversell that. Talk about the science, and that's that. So we sold 10,000 on the first day, and we had 100,000 by the end of that year. And suddenly, this whole industry of consumer genomics was born. And today, the leading providers are probably 23andMe, so they launched 2 years later in 2007 with much more of a medical focus. Ancestry DNA launched in 2012. It's now the dominant player. They sell 1 million kits a quarter, which is pretty amazing. It's become a significant industry, and so some of us now are thinking, we've made it past this initial early adopter phase where, say, 6, 7, 8 million people have gotten their DNA tested. What happens when DNA sequencing is ubiquitous? Because if you look at the cost of sequencing a genome, it has fallen off a cliff since about 2007. The initial Human Genome Project took over a decade, cost famously in excess of $1 billion. Some people will quote 3 billion as the figure, but a lot of money for one genome. There is a new machine made by the monopoly player in the business called Illumina, called the NovaSeq, that is shipping right now and being installed in labs around the world, that promises to, by next year, be able to sequence an entire human genome in 2 days for $100. And the price continues to drop. So what's happening is the price is dropping towards zero, and that means the technology is going to be applied ubiquitously. So in developed societies like the US, within the next 5 years or so, I think it will be routine for every child to have their genome sequenced at birth. How do you engage with that information? And so that's what we're trying to develop, is tools to allow people to understand their genomes. And Insitome is building applications to basically do that interpretation for people.
Got it. Okay. So you've become a geneticist, a population geneticist, you're an anthropologist, you're an entrepreneur. all of these things, these transitions have, and I mean, you exist in them all at once and separately. Each of these have involved you communicating with the public, engaging with the public, and helping them support your idea and rallying people behind this idea. You gave the example of Land Rover, and I know it must not have been as easy as it sounds. How do you rally people behind your ideas in a way that's effective? And was that transition hard from being a scientist and then becoming this person?
I'll answer the second part first. I mean, I think it is a little difficult for scientists to think outside of their peer group, because as a scientist, you are told from the beginning, you need to justify everything. You're going to have a lot of other highly trained, specialized people digging into your work, picking it apart, and you need to be able to support every single detail. And that is the way science works. That's the whole point of peer review when you submit a manuscript for publication, for instance, or when you apply for a grant. It's the way science, kind of keeps itself honest. But when you start to translate the results of scientific efforts, research, discovery, et cetera, to the general public, you have to leave out some of the details, inevitably. You can't tell people exactly how you designed your PCR reaction, which led to the discovery of Genghis Khan's Y chromosome, because quite honestly, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it does to the scientists, but it doesn't to the people who are trying to understand the takeaway. And so that ability to kind of translate the complexities of science without losing some of the detail, enough of the detail to make it scientifically correct, to people who are not specialists is what we call storytelling. And so storytelling is an incredibly valuable skill. It's a really important skill for scientists, and more these days when scientists apply for grants, research grants from the NSF or NIH, you have to give a statement that can be understandable to the general public about what's the relevance of your research. And I think that's a very positive thing for scientists to have to do, because after all, they are spending our money as taxpayers, and so we should be able to understand what it is they're doing with it. But being able to tell a story is a skill that everybody needs. And it's one of those core skills that, as we start to peer into the distant future in the 21st century, 10, 20, 30 years from now, as AI starts to replace more and more jobs, what are the skills that you need to have to be employable? I think storytelling, the ability to construct a narrative, to take complex events that may seem unrelated in some way and to build a story and convey what the essence is of those events to people who aren't specialists, I think that's a really critical skill set. And it's a really important skill to have as an entrepreneur, because as anybody who started a company knows, you get bogged down in all the details when you're thinking about this. You have some flash of an idea, you talk to your co-founder about it, you figure out the technical details of how you're going to do it, what's your go-to-market strategy, what's your ramp speed, and so on. And then you have to go out and actually explain why this is such a cool and earth-shattering idea to people who haven't been privy to the last 6 to 12 months of conversations you've been having. And so you have to use that same skill set. Storytelling is a very important part of being an entrepreneur, and also, I would argue, being a scientist.
Mm-hmm. How do you develop those skills? How did you develop them?
I think it was out of necessity. I was always interested in writing, and wrote a lot of things, was very interested in the process whereby you translate complex science for the general public. Read a lot of Stephen Jay Gould, who's a famous evolutionary biologist who had a monthly column in Natural History magazine when I was growing up, so in the 70s and 80s. And kind of, was really intrigued by his ability to tell a story around a scientific subject that on the surface, if you're not a scientist or you're not a specialist in that area, might seem to be a little bit dry. But there's a way to tell an interesting story about almost everything, and that's what Gould was able to do. And I always admired that skill set and tried to emulate it in my own writing, and then eventually when I started talking to people, and giving lectures and things like that.
How do you stay conscious when you're telling this story of leaving out the right details and keeping the correct details still in the story to make sure, because I'm sure at times you have to satisfy both the scientists in the room and the general populace. How do you manage that line?
It's tough to do. A lot of people, at least back when I started bringing science directly to people in the 90s, there was kind of a certain level of disdain in the ivory tower toward scientists who would leave the ivory tower and would go out and engage with the public, and inevitably would have to leave out some of the details. It's a skill you learn. If you leave in too many details, then you're not telling a story that people are engaged with or interested in necessarily. If you leave out too many details, then it's kind of pointless and it doesn't really teach anyone anything. And so you have to learn to walk that fine line. And so it's a skill that you develop over time.
So I guess back to the story of the foundation of Insitome. So you talked about 23andMe developing in '07, and then you have Ancestry DNA. What made you realize that there was this niche that you could fill, that there was this need that would be coming up, and you could see your company filling it?
So when I was with National Geographic, I was there from 2005 to 2015 when we wound down the Genographic Project. There were a lot of things that I wanted to implement. And this is the difference between what people who start companies will tell you is intrapreneurship, which is innovating within an existing larger company, and entrepreneurship, which is creating your own company out of nothing, going from 0 to 1, as Peter Thiel would call it. Entrepreneurship is a great way to cut your teeth on conceptualizing and building out teams and creating products, because you have all the great resources of a big company. So you are free to a certain extent to fail in a way that you're not able to do that as an entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs always have very limited resources. So it's more challenging. On the other hand, decisions in big companies are made slowly, and you have to go through many levels of management and approval and so on. And often decisions are made at the highest levels, which seem ridiculous to people, lower down in the scale. And so there were lots of things that I wanted to do at Genographic and simply wasn't able to do within the context of that larger organization, which, it makes sense. I mean, the core business of National Geographic it's a media company. It's not a genomics company. And so it was always a little bit incongruous for, us to be creating the consumer genomics industry. But on the other hand, given that what we're doing is telling stories around your genome, there was some kind of reasoning to it where it made sense. And so I had all these ideas, including testing dogs, 23andMe for dogs. We were going to do it as GenoPets. It actually had approval up at the highest levels, and then a new CEO came in and lots of shifts went on. And so we took that idea, and that was actually the first company I started when I moved down here, in addition to reopening Antones, which I had acquired in the interim. But we started a company called Embark, which was initially meant to be part of dog DNA testing, Embark. Anyway, so it was with colleagues at Cornell University. So Adam Boyko, who is one of the leading dog geneticists in the world. We wanted to be able to design a test where, imagine you go to a shelter and you adopt a mixed breed puppy, and you know absolutely nothing about the breeds that went into it, or the health risks, any genetic diseases, because dog breeds have a lot of genetic diseases. They're highly inbred, and over the years they've accumulated all these mutations and so on, and fixed variants. And so, our vision was, imagine going into a shelter and you scan a barcode with your smartphone and you see everything about that dog instantaneously, because they've all been genetically tested. And so we raised funding for and started Embark. I was a co-founder of that. I was the chief product officer. So it was my job to kind of develop that first kit and to oversee the information that went into the website, work with the engineering team and the science team to build that out into a product. So still involved with Embark as an advisor, and still own some of the company. But as we were kind of getting that product out the door, I had this other opportunity to create Insitome, and that came out of my involvement with Helix, which was a spin-off of Illumina, this monopoly player in genome sequencing that I mentioned earlier. I was on the scientific advisory board when they launched, and was talking to one of the co-founders a few months after their initial launch, when they kind of announced their funding, $130 million or whatever their Series A was. And we were having lunch in Palo Alto, and we were talking about, what they're trying to do is basically build a platform for genomic discovery. They subsidize the sequencing. So we're doing genome sequencing, not just scanning with a chip, but actually sequencing the genome, and heavily subsidized. And then you download apps to discover things about what your genome sequence means. So basically building out the app store for consumer genomics. Cool, really big idea. And I was telling Justin at this lunch, the exciting part for me is not the platform. I mean, yes, that's going to be incredibly valuable. It's a great business opportunity, but building out the apps, that's the really fun part. That's the really creative stuff. So I get a call from a guy at the private equity firm that funded them about a month later, and he says, let's talk. And so I, inadvertently had raised capital without even really pitching for it. And was in this position of having to decide, do I stay on with Embark or do I go out and form Insitome? And because I had all these ideas that I'd wanted to implement at Genographic that I'd never been able to, that's the reason I went off and founded Insitome. And
Okay.
it's been awesome. So we were founded last summer of 2016. We've been in business a little over a year now. We've released 2 products so far. So the proper Helix platform launch was at the beginning of August. Our first product was released then. We just released another product last week, which tells you all about your metabolism and how it's adapted to decisions that your ancestors have made over the last 10,000 years or so. So the reason you're lactose tolerant or glucose tolerant or your alcohol tolerance or fatty acid synthesis patterns and all this other stuff. So the whole thing with us is we're trying to tell you the how and the why, not just do you have this trait or not, but why do you have it and how did it happen?
Cool. Do you hope that this data is actionable, or do you hope that this is just a source of knowledge to know more about yourself?
A combination. I mean, the initial products are largely driven by curiosity. So when we, were looking at the market, and Helix did the same thing, UBS did a white paper last year on the consumer genomics market, you ask people, why are you testing? And the majority of them, 80%, come back and say, curiosity. I just want to know what my DNA is doing for me, with no specification beyond that. And ancestry. So I want to know where I came from, and in our case, curiosity about the traits and how that ties into your ancestry. Only about 40% of people are interested in medical testing. And so 60%, therefore, are not interested in doing medical testing. And in fact, consumer medical genetic testing is now heavily regulated by the FDA. In fact, 23andMe, you mentioned, were shut down by the FDA, the medical side of their testing in 2013. And it's only this year that they've started to implement some of those medical tests again. So actionable, yes, in the sense of wellness, in the sense of prevention. Not actionable in the sense of we're going to test you for breast cancer variants, BRCA1 and 2 variants that have high penetrance and mean you're going to have to, have a double mastectomy. That's not the sort of test we're selling. I feel very strongly that those kinds of tests should be explored with your physician because the only action you're going to be able to take will be done through your physician. Mm-hmm. But in terms of curiosity-driven stuff, ancestry, wellness products that are supported by science, yeah, that's really what we're focusing on right now.
Okay. Do you see wearable health technologies playing a role in the curiosity and kind of fueling that even more over the course of the next 5 years?
Yeah, if the wearables are good enough.
Okay.
If they're actually giving you useful information. I mean, I think the Apple Watch is starting to get there. And we're seeing, Aetna, big health insurers, starting to give those out or subsidize them for their clients or their customers. I think wearable technology, all of this, I mean, it's a big data cloud. We have more and more data associated with ourselves. Your genome is simply another part of your data cloud that you're going to carry around with you, along with activity data and your credit history and your grades when you're in college and all this other stuff. You are this giant data cloud. And, to the extent that you can make use of that and become healthier, I think that's a positive thing.
Okay, that's really exciting. So I guess this kind of also gets into electronic health records and whether providers and hospitals own them or whether patients do. And do you have opinions about that, about whether we should move on the ownership of medical data, not only ancestral data, but also, what mutations I have, all this stuff that the doctor knows, should I be able to know almost exactly what the doctor knows about me?
I believe very strongly that you should own all of your data. Absolutely. And you should be able to opt out of anything that is, or any entity that's using your data. So if people want to withdraw from an Insitome app or from Helix itself, they can, and we can erase your data. No, I mean, I think you should have access to your electronic health records and should be able to bring them with you. You should be able to understand them in some way. There should be some way of interpreting those records for you for people who don't have any medical training. You know, I think empowering people to take more control over their wellness is generally a good thing, because if you think about the practice of medicine, it hasn't changed that much since the time of the Greeks or even before. What happens is somebody develops a set of symptoms that are so onerous that you're willing to spend money to go see a specialist to try and treat the symptoms, and hopefully in the process of treating the symptoms, they will fix the underlying disease. But often you have no idea what the underlying disease is. You're literally just treating those symptoms. Now we have this ability with modern genomic technologies and other molecular technologies to really understand what the underlying causes of disease are. And I mean, the best example of this is in cancer, where, you know, historically cancers have been classified, the tumors have been classified according to the tissue that they're in. But in fact, the best way to classify them is by the genetic mutations they have. And that's feeding back directly into the treatment, because we are literally understanding what the cause of those cancers is. Understanding the underlying causes allows you to diagnose earlier, and to the extent that you understand, you know, what's creating those mutations in the case of cancer, to prevent them from happening. And so that's the vision of medicine in the future, is that empowered by knowledge, we will be healthier and we can avoid getting sick. And so our interactions with the medical system will change over time and hopefully become less expensive and more effective.
Yeah. So I really like the preventative side and the actionable side of it. Do you think this has the potential to kind of bridge the difference in inequity in healthcare in the United States? Do you think this will drive that forward and help make sure that, like, the class divide that's coming up, the political consequences of that will start to shrink if the health begins to become closer between the higher and lower classes?
I certainly hope so. To the extent that, you know, knowledge allows you to democratize wellness and to make it less expensive, you know, it should help to close that divide. There are new, you know, cancer therapies and other disease therapies that are being developed right now that cost $1 million or more. That's a lot of money. And, you know, many of these are still classified as experimental, so you don't know how effective they are. I would like to see a lot of that money, because if you're spending $1 million on a treatment, that means it probably costs billions to develop, and they're trying to recoup their R&D costs. I'd like to see, you know, some of that money spent on better ways of preventing disease rather than simply treating diseases.
Okay. I kind of want to get into the ethical questions of data, of ownership of the data that you talked about. You talked about in Helix and Insitome, if you don't want the company to own your data anymore, to look at your data anymore, you can retract that. How do you feel like that's an obligation of every genomics company to uphold, that if the consumer wants to opt out of any oversight over their data, they can do that?
I think it is. And it's not just genomics companies. I mean, again, there's nothing special about genomic data. It's part of this data cloud that you carry around with you, along with your patterns of interaction on social media, which are incredibly valuable to advertisers. We make use of them at Insitome. So we can profile anybody in this room and sell products directly to them based on their interests. I mean, this is what companies do now, and it's the reason why Facebook is so valuable and why Google/Alphabet are so valuable. It's because of advertising. It's not because people enjoy going on to see what their, you know, friends' kids look like. So genomic data is another part of the data cloud, and people are profiting off of your data. And so, you know, the reason why Facebook and Google are so valuable is because they're profiting off of data that you share freely. Genomic data is the same way. 23andMe's business model is not to be a consumer genomics company. It never has been. So basically, what they're trying to do is use the consumer side to collect enough data that they can then share it with pharma companies and try to develop new drugs. And in fact, in their latest round, they just raised, I think it was a Series J, you know, ridiculous, but Series J, $250 million, specifically to pivot into being more of a pharma company. and utilizing that database. So, I think a lot of people would consent to having their data used in that way, but you should be told about that intended use. And your data, therefore, does have some value. And so, some of us have started talking about models where, people are compensated in some way for sharing their data. It's complicated because in all likelihood, you're not going to discover anything, but you might.
Okay. What do you think about weighing the risks between the wrongful use of this data versus the potential benefits of this data being used? Do you think that's a conversation that can lead down dark paths where you start discriminating against different parts of the population due to the genetic data? Or do you think that it can be regulated enough that the potential positive benefits will outweigh the slight negative benefits that may come with possible wrongdoing?
Honestly, I'm not that concerned because, again, I don't see genetic data as being any more private, personal, or dangerous than any other kind of data. I would argue that a lot of the other information that people are spewing freely out onto the internet is much scarier and potentially damaging in the long run. So the stuff that you post on Instagram, the stuff you post on Facebook and Twitter and so on, that becomes part of your data cloud that follows you around forever. And it's part of the reason why in the European Union right now, there have been massive lawsuits to force Google, for instance, to remove certain items from searches because people want the ability to rehabilitate themselves. And if they committed, some crime or transgression in the past, they don't want that to be front and center on every Google search for the rest of their lives. It gets down to, at a societal level, how much privacy do we want to grant to individuals? And how powerful are the companies that control access to that information? And so, genomic data is another part of that. Everybody's carrying potentially fatal mutations, usually in a heterozygous form, but, things that are potentially very dangerous. Everybody in this room has some of them in their genome. We know from having sequenced enough genomes now. In most cases, they're not really harming the individual, but could you use them to discriminate? Potentially, but you could use a lot of other things as well. I think we as a society need to make decisions about how we utilize personal information, period, including genomic information. So in the case of genetics, there's something called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that was passed under the Bush administration that prevents employers and health insurers in particular from discriminating against someone on the basis of their genetic data. But it does not apply to long-term care insurance. It does not apply to life insurance. So if you test and find that you have, one of these high penetrance breast cancer variants, and then you immediately go out and take out a life insurance policy, and you don't reveal that, then you have in effect lied to the life insurance company, and they can choose not to cover you in the future as a result.
Okay.
So, we as a society need to figure out, do we want to force life insurance companies to cover people who know that they have pre-existing conditions or predispositions to pre-existing conditions? To say that fast. That's a bigger question. That's a societal issue. And the problem is, most people outside of science don't really get the science. I mean, genomics is like this big, scary thing. Like, people don't really understand predisposition, relative risk, some of the complexities of this stuff. And so, to the extent that talking about science and storytelling, the stuff that I've spent a lot of my career doing, can educate people, beyond the scientific community, and hopefully maybe eventually people who might become legislators, that's a good thing because everybody needs to be, up to speed on science because it is having an impact on the world we live in. Whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it or know about it or not, it is having an impact.
Okay. So I think a lot of us in this room are wanting to be scientists, are scientists ourselves. How would I start as a student here at UT or as a graduate student here at UT? How would I start becoming a better storyteller, being able to communicate my ideas better with the layman rather than only being in the conference room with other faculty?
Stand up and tell stories. Force yourself to give presentations and work in cross-disciplinary teams. This is one of the things that as a CEO, it's so hard to get across to people on campus when we talk about the skill sets that we need in employees. Every single company these days is going to have interdisciplinary teams. So you're never just going to be working with other biochemists You're going to be working with biochemists and designers and engineers and possibly airline pilots. You have no idea. But you have to have that ability to work cross-disciplinarily, and the way you do that is that you've got your set of core expertise, but you have to be able to communicate its relevance to people outside of that discipline. And one of the things, I was actually involved in this task force to start to think about revamping undergraduate education here at UT last year. And this is one of the things I brought up, is like that ability to construct a narrative is really, that's part of teamwork. It's part of being a good team member, is being able to communicate effectively. To bring your set of skills, which you have uniquely because you've spent all this time studying things and so on, to bring that to a team setting, but then to be able to communicate outside of your skill set and to have some relevance to the broader group. I think that's really critical. So I think forcing yourself outside of your little corner of expertise and having to communicate with people outside of your own major is a really good thing.
Okay.
So to the extent that you can start to do that, if there are, I don't know, science happy hours where people stand up and talk about whatever research they're doing to people who are outside of their major, that's a cool thing.
Mm-hmm. I think we're starting to see some of that here at UT, and that's encouraging to know that you think it's important and it's growing here. What are you most excited about in the upcoming future for your company?
The next product release.
Okay.
I mean, right now we are very much, heads down, blinders on, focusing on getting these out. We have just started to, market the products because, unlike a lot of other companies, it's not a single app that you download that is our product. Our product is actually this ongoing engagement. It's kind of like what we've created is the Kindle, and the Kindle has no meaning until you start to populate it with books. And until you have a certain number of books, you don't see why it's worth doing, because you could just go buy separate books. And so to the extent that people start to see this as an ongoing story and an engagement, eventually converting over to a subscription model, you're subscribing to your genome, we're the Spotify for your DNA, that's the long-term vision. Until people can start to see that, there's no point in marketing. So we're just ramping up marketing now, have been very focused on product development. Mm-hmm. And product thinking is something that I also identified in this discussion with the revamp of the undergraduate curriculum. It's the way companies work. They think in terms of product releases and iterating on products. What's the minimum viable product? How can we improve that based on feedback? It is the way every single startup works and most successful large companies these days, and it's simply not taught at the undergraduate level. Product thinking and design thinking, I think that's another very important skill set. The idea that you've got these discrete pieces, what is the absolute minimum we need to be able to offer the features that we feel are critical for people to recognize this as the product we're hoping that it might be, and then how do you make those better over time using feedback? Mm-hmm. Really, really important skill.
So you didn't go to business school or anything, but how did you learn these product development skills, these entrepreneurship skills? Was it through failure, trial? How did it come about?
Yeah, I mean, it was, again, I was lucky enough to be able to start Genographic within a very big, successful, well-branded company. And so we had access to a lot of resources and a lot of people who did have MBAs. And so I was able to kind of learn on the fly. Mm-hmm. And, you also surround yourself with people who have skills that you don't have. So my co-founder at Insitome has an MBA. And he's good at the finance stuff, and he's good at operations and so on. The stuff that I'm not necessarily as good at, but on the other hand, he doesn't have the scientific background and the vision for what the product should be. And so we really complement each other. That's another important skill, is like you got to figure out when you don't know something, be honest with yourself about it, and find people who can complement you in some way. If you're going to start a company, you're not going to be able to do everything. And if you try, you're going to fail. I mean, I literally have seen so many startups fail because the CEO thinks that they can and should be doing absolutely everything. They're too involved in the weeds on every single aspect of the company, and they're not able to, have that overall vision for the direction the company should go in.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think we're going to open up to some questions now. So if you'd like to ask a question, please just line up at the microphones we have there, and we can kind of set up two lines. We'll alternate between the two.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, go for it.
So I know you mentioned Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1. I was actually reading an excerpt from it last night.
What'd you think?
Yeah, it's great. But
Yeah.
that specific passage, he was talking about how most startups can at least build some version of their product, but a majority fail because they actually don't have good distribution channels. They can't get it into the hands of customers.
He also likes monopolies, too.
He does too. So I was curious how your company is approaching actually getting customers to kind of drive them towards your product, your distribution channels.
That's a great question. So as I said, we're just starting to ramp up. Part of it is explaining the vision of the company. And again, this idea of ongoing, engaging storytelling. We have some advantages in that people in this area who are generally interested in possibly getting a DNA test have usually heard of me. And so, to the extent that I can brand it as, this is my company, it gives us a slight advantage. But really, you have to build up that vision of what the company is trying to do. Consumer genomics is no longer a brand new industry. It's starting to mature. As we move beyond 8 million people tested, you can no longer say it's this scrappy little, startup industry and, very few people have even heard of this. And no, I mean, most people these days have heard of 23andMe and Ancestry, and they have a general sense of what to expect. So the question is how do you start to distinguish yourself? What are the things you can do better than anybody else? And that's one of the advantages of being in a startup, because you can make those decisions and change direction very quickly based on the feedback that you get. You have to listen to people, though. So, you send out your version of the product into the world, you get feedback from early users, and then you start to make it better. You start to emphasize the things that people really want. Because at the end of the day, the customer decides whether you succeed or not. That's the way business works.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, there's so many questions I have right now, but I'll try to stick to one. So the question I came up to the microphone with was, as you look out into the audience right now, I'm wondering if you could kind of synthesize what a segmentation would look like as you literally look at us. What do you see, and what kind of products could you sell to us as consumers of genomic information? I mean, because I think your eyes on this audience are probably different than everyone else's, right?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about the typical audience for consumer genomics so far.
Yeah.
It is older, and it is better educated, and typically has more disposable income. And so the average Genographic customer is in their 60s, will often have some sort of graduate degree, often in engineering. They really want to dig down into the data. I think that's the cross-section of early adopters, and so the products that we release initially were somewhat targeting that group, but in terms of the design and the features, we're trying to move the average age down a little bit. So we're taking a mobile-first approach. Some of the color palettes, some of the features that we're reporting on, et cetera, we feel are going to appeal to a slightly younger audience. And I think that's the big opportunity, is starting to think about what makes genomics relevant to somebody in their late 20s, early 30s versus somebody in their late 60s. The people in the late 60s are almost uniformly driven by genealogy, ancestry things. People in their late 20s, early 30s are thinking about dating apps. They're thinking about, they're thinking about getting married and having kids, and so what could our kids look like? I mean, these are things that we're starting to think about building into products. So we've got an appearance app that we're working on. One of the features we want to build into that is if you've got, you and your spouse or significant other have tested, can you start to think about, what could the kids look like? Just anything like that would start to appeal to a slightly different audience than the one that's tested through consumer genomics companies so far.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Renita. Thank
Hi.
you so much for coming here and sharing your thoughts with us. I'd like to start with that because I come from the B school and this is like such a refreshing change. So my question was around marketing as well. I was amazed by the initial spike in sales and even the year-end sales number that you mentioned, like in the earlier one of the earlier questions. So what do you think, was that a result of just the early adopter enthusiasm, or was there a marketing genius involved there? And you also mentioned that your marketing team is currently picking up, and you're thinking about how to tackle the area of customer retention. How do you have customers engage? Like, how do you build that journey? And you mentioned Spotify of genomics. That sort of made me perk up my ears. So, is it possible for you to share some examples there as to how you're planning to do that?
Yeah, sure. So let's go back and kind of see if I can remember all of this. The initial question was, how do we explain the early spike when we launched Genographic? A big part of that was National Geographic's brand. That's the power of having a huge brand like that. I mean, that's $1 billion brand. It's like launching a new drink under the aegis of Coca-Cola. Everybody's heard of Coca-Cola. If Coke says that it's okay, it's probably okay. So that was part of it. Part of it was also obviously the storytelling and the idea that we could create very media-savvy depictions of the kinds of results you would get and their relevance to you. And so that's where the storytelling comes in. And for us as a smaller company, we want to build our brand. Part of that is, trying to convince people to trust us. We are grounded in solid science. When we say that you have this characteristic, yes, in all likelihood it's true because the science is there. I've done things in the past. You've trusted me before, so I'm now transferring my interests over to the company. But beyond that, in terms of customer engagement, a lot of what we're going to be doing is content marketing. So it's, again, it's this ongoing storytelling. It's learning new things. It's blogs and podcasts and updates to the products themselves. And then, of course, ongoing releases of new products with a regular cadence. So, what we're thinking about now is like, who do we need to add on the engineering side to increase the cadence at which we start to release these? Can we get out to a monthly product release when it really does start to feel like a subscription? And in between, can we be adding new features? The great thing about the Helix ecosystem is because we're dealing with DNA sequence data rather than chip data, whenever something new is discovered, all the new discoveries are being done at the sequence level, not at the chip level. Whenever something new is discovered, we just have to pull down the variant and include it in our product to report on it. We don't have to resequence anybody. So you only ever test your DNA once. Yeah. So we just pull down this information from the cloud. We just specified a new RS ID, a new SNP ID. And so it allows us to have this ongoing update and engagement of the existing products, but also to build out the new products that you simply download digitally and you get the results immediately. There's no need to spend $100 and wait for 6 weeks anymore to do that.
Wow, 6 weeks for processing?
Well, Helix is actually faster than that. Their lab is awesome. Mm-hmm. So right now they're processing samples in 2 weeks. Wow. So, ask any genetics researcher here on campus how much it would cost and how long it would take to get, an extended exome sequence. So it's the exome and a lot of other information outside of this. So basically all the protein coding regions of the genome, all the important stuff. And they would say, well, you'd probably spend between $500 and $1,000. And it would probably take you a few weeks. 2 weeks, less than $100. So that's what allows us to play in that consumer space. If it were hundreds of dollars, it would cut the size of the market down significantly. Mm-hmm. But because, Illumina and Helix are kind of semi-subsidizing this because they have a rev share on the products that we sell, the revenue share, they're able to offer that initial sequencing at a very low price. And so that opens it up to the consumer realm. So it's a really exciting time. And it's fun to think about, creating products on that canvas versus what we've been dealing with for the last decade or so, which is you create this static chip that determines every test you're going to do from then on out. And it's very difficult to update that. Like if you want to build a new chip, that's going to take you 6 to 8 months. And it's very expensive. So here we're dealing with a much higher order of genetic information, and it makes things possible that weren't really possible before.
Thank you so much. I think I have more questions, but I'm going to let others ask you.
Hi, so you talked about this giant cloud of genomics data that already exists. We talk, and anywhere there's an overload of data, there's an opportunity for machine learning and AI applications. And with this, when the data is so complicated, there's obviously an opportunity to be had there. Will you talk on how your company is using that and the future applications of these technologies?
Yeah, machine learning is a big buzz phrase right now. It is incredibly important. Most of our early products are not using machine learning, but there are a few in the future where we're starting to explore that possibility. When you get into some of the, complex traits with continuous variation, polygenic traits, where you've got hundreds or even thousands of genetic variants scattered around the genome, how do you account for how all of those variants interact in a single individual to produce the trait? That's where it would start to come into play. And so we're starting to think about products that would, encompass things like that.
Awesome.
Some of the early stuff is much simpler. The next product that's coming out on regional ancestry is probably scientifically the most complex that we've released so far. But some of the ones that we've got in the pipeline for next year are going to be even, more in the realm of machine learning.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious, what things have you done that you found most effective to develop the skill of storytelling?
Part of it is just being forced to stand up and talk. No, I mean, listen, a lot of scientists, are not comfortable standing up and talking. And, again, because what you're doing in science is so incredibly complicated and focused, it's very hard to make yourself step back and say, this is the impact of what I'm doing. And being forced to do that, like being part of a large team at Stanford when I did my postdoc, and having to explain to people who really don't understand the intricacies of Y chromosome STRs, what this means. And you say Genghis Khan's Y chromosome, people are like, oh, I get that. Okay, that makes sense. So again, it's that kind of cross-disciplinary teamwork and having to give presentations that gives you the facility with kind of taking a higher level view. Not necessarily a 30,000 foot view, but maybe a 5,000 foot view or a 10,000 foot view.
And were you talking to other scientists, or were you trying to address the public when you were
A
doing this?
combination, but also to anthropologists and ethicists, yeah. And teaching helps with that as well. Yeah, and students are not afraid to give you feedback on your teaching these days, unlike when I was an undergraduate. So yeah, I mean, all of that helps with storytelling and writing as well. To the extent that you can start to write for non-specialists, a blog, at a minimum, set up a Medium account and write about why you got excited about the project you're doing, and then start to do that regularly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
What's the role of epigenetics in what you're doing or what you anticipate or would like to be doing?
Good question, and we don't know. We honestly don't know. Epigenetics is a very new field. I would argue that it's somewhat overhyped. I think it is. I mean, there's some really compelling results from epigenetics. So the Dutch hunger winter babies and so on. This example of people in the latter part of the Second World War who went through a famine just before the end of the war, and the pregnant women passed on all of these epigenetic traits to their kids, so they tended to grow up with hypertension, obesity, and so on. And I believe that passed on to the next generation as well. I mean, this is really interesting, compelling stuff. It doesn't really touch on the types of things we're reporting on right now, but I think in the future, when we understand how universal epigenetics might be, then we would start to incorporate it. Right now, I think a lot of people would like to believe that everything is epigenetic. We're almost entering into, in some cases, when I read these wellness blogs that talk about epigenetics, a new era of Lysenkoism, where simply believing that you can change is enough and your DNA will respond, and that simply isn't the fact. But the environment does have an epigenetic effect on the way genes are expressed, for instance, and to the extent that we can really discover the scientific basis for that, that's when we would start to incorporate it. So I think there's a lot of potential for epigenetics right now, but just like the microbiome, I think there's been a lot of hype.
We'll take one or two more questions. Go for it.
I was wondering if it's common practice for companies like Insitome, or you mentioned one at Lumina. Is that correct? Yeah. Mm-hmm. If it's common for them to sell that genetic information to advertising companies or insurance companies, for that matter?
No.
Not common.
It has never been done as far as I'm aware.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So my question for you is, in starting your business and kind of developing, have you had a mentor either in science or in business that you lean to for guidance?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, mentors are critical. You need people whose opinions you respect to be able to bounce ideas off of, whether it's scientifically or in business. One of my best buddies here on campus, who I consider to be a mentor and kind of an unofficial board member of Insitome, is Bob Metcalf. And Bob is great because, Bob is kind of no BS. If he believes something, he will just tell you, what he thinks, and he's not going to beat around the bush. So it's good to have people who are just brutally honest with you. And he's been brutally honest with me about, things he sees wrong with Insitome's business model. Among them, he's like, you're too intertwined with Helix. They own the platform, and how do you distinguish yourself? And so these are things that we're starting to think about in the marketing in particular. But yeah, mentors are absolutely critical.
Thank you.
With the amount of genomic data being collected, I'm curious to know if dating websites have been interested in acquiring this information to produce some kind of genetic matchmaking. Because I've known
not just dating websites. We have thought about products like that too.
I have known multiple individuals whose relationships have fallen apart after genetic tests have came back saying that they will be at this amount of risk if they get married and have kids. So
interesting.
So I'm curious to know if I think there is a market problem out there. I'm just curious to know if any kind of companies try to capitalize upon it.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of lots of scary sounding products, playing on Tinder, swipe left, swipe right, based on, medical testing results. So to the extent that you can make it recreational and not scary and not something that could be used to discriminate against people, I think there perhaps is room for a product like that. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about doing that.
No, it's just say like you collect this genomic information. Yeah. This individual, here's your 10 most genetically compatible potential mates, and you can say hello, introduce yourself, that sort of thing. So I'm just curious to know if there's some kind of.
But what about love? Come on. Let's talk after.
All right, let's just wrap up with one more question.
Yeah. Hey, so I'm actually a scientist at Thermo Fisher, largely responsible for the Ion Torrent platform of sequencing. Cool. And my kind of question, just kind of like being involved with the technology, is have y'all experienced like a certain amount of error rate or like issues with accuracy, and like how do you mitigate those kind of problems?
No, I mean, Helix is doing clinical grade exomes, so they're in excess of 50x, and so when they call variants, we're absolutely certain that they're real. We have a lower cutoff. As you know, it's probabilistic, so there are some sites that are going to be less than 50x and some that'll be 100 plus x. But we've got an internal company cutoff as well. We're not calling anything that we're uncertain about. We also do imputation as a kind of check to see if it makes sense. So is it on the right haplotype? So there are things you can implement into the analysis to try and account for that. But no, I mean, Helix is running an awesome lab. It's really, really impressive. It's one of the largest and most efficient sequencing labs in the world.
Thank you.
Sure.
As we wrap up, I just want to thank a few people that made this event possible. The Herb Kelleher Center, first and foremost, for collaborating with the College of Natural Sciences and putting on this event. Two key people who made this possible, Dr. Scott Livengood and Dr. Melissa Taylor, thank you guys so much. And lastly, I want to emphasize the importance of the College of Natural Sciences having more of these events, because this is really helping us bring forth a new era of science entrepreneurship here at UT. And with Austin becoming a bigger and bigger entrepreneurial hub, we need to make sure that UT and CNS is plugged into that. So thank you, Dr. Spencer Wells. Appreciate it.
Great to be here.